The top U.S. diplomat heads to Russia to seek help in defusing the civil war in Syria. Secretary of State John Kerry will re-engage Syria's most powerful ally. This after one of America's closest allies renewed fears that the war could spiral into a regional conflict. Over the weekend, Israeli airstrikes hit a military complex near Damascus. But the bombings were not meant as a direct confrontation against the Syrian regime. Israel says Iranian missiles were stored in that complex and were going to be shipped to Hezbollah, a terror group based in Lebanon that has long been Israel's enemy. The Obama administration defended the Israeli strike.
The transfer of sophisticated weapons to terrorist organizations like Hezbollah is certainly a concern and a threat to Israel. And they have the right to act in their own sovereign interest in response to those concerns.
Joining us is Mike Lyons, CBS News Military Analyst. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Emery.
So lots to talk about. The Israeli airstrike was targeting these Hezbollah-bound weapons. Not really supposed to have anything to do with the civil war in Syria, but is there a concern that this strike could escalate the civil war and result in a regional conflict?
No question. Anytime you bring more military force into that region, it could actually spill over into the borders and do those kinds of things. Israel was going after the missile chain of Hezbollah coming from Iran, being stored first in Syria, then for eventual shipment into Lebanon to be stored, to be used at a future date. So smart move by the Israelis. They always act in their own best interest. It's a good example of them getting out in front of a problem.
Yeah. Now, Israel, of course, is a key ally of the United States. We've been having discussions here about whether or not the Syrian regime crossed that line, that red line, and used chemical weapons. Could you see this as an opportunity for the U.S. to get involved, or it's not going to happen?
I think U.S. involvement has got to have clear national interest. The president's got to communicate that specifically, what our goals are and what our objectives are going to be. We have to be very careful with the limited use, really, of military power. I don't see us doing anything, boots on the ground. We see the senators and everybody saying that. But a no-fly zone, for example, could mean boots on the ground. It's going to mean attacking inside of Syria. It's going to mean an act of war. The Syrians could perceive that. So we've got to understand the ramifications of what all that potential military power is.
So is that why you think that we haven't seen a no-fly zone like we saw in Libya?
Yeah, very complicated. Also, the Syrian air defense system, which is built by the Russians, is much better than we saw in Libya. And I'll say Syria is a real country. 20 million people, had a very strong army at the time. They have much more capability. It's going to take a lot longer to ensure that we have air superiority in Syria before we decide that that no-fly zone actually is going to work.
And what are some of the other concerns in terms of U.S. military involvement? We had talked before this segment about, you know, if there are chemicals, where do they go? Will they just disappear?
Securing them, and again, in that region, that part of the world, it's flush with all kinds of different weapon systems. We don't want those chemical weapons to fall into the hands of terrorists, to fall into the hands of Hezbollah, to be used against Israel, to be used against other regional players. But again, the chief of staff of the army, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, have said that that mission might even be impossible. It might not be knowable because they continue to move those weapons around. We'll do as best we can, but there's no guarantee that those don't fall into the wrong hands.
Very, very quickly, are there any other military options that are feasible?
I think a border within a space between the two countries will be important to watch refugees out. But other than that, give intel and give what we can to the rebel side at this point in time. But other than that, I think the president's on the right path.
Major Mike Lyons, a CBS News military analyst. Thanks for joining us again this morning.
Thanks, Emery.